Fordism, the term that Gramsci proposed for means of production. Keynesian for the economist Keynes, who introduced the way of managing an industrial society through the creation of what came to be called a welfare state, where where the state basically ensures that people are paid well enough and have enough money to continue consuming what the industrial system produces. So the first of these technopolitical paradigms is called Keynesian Fordism. The second is what I call neoliberal informationalism. That's the paradigm in which we live now. Its technological component is obviously the computer and the network communication system. Its attempt at assuring a social fit, at making some kind of a coherent society, has been called neoliberalism. We are seeing that this is an utter failure, and we're heading for a big crisis of neoliberal informationalism, or rather we're in that crisis right now. The first of these two periods, Keynesian Fordism, corresponds to the disciplinary diagram that I just presented, and the second one obviously corresponds to the interaction diagram. The construction of such paradigms allows you to map out the present social framework by comparing it to an immediately preceding one. It allows you to understand how the present period arose from the crisis and breakup of the preceding period. And it allows you to sense the onrush of a new crisis, like the one that has been building up for the last couple of years. Now, the creation of this analytical framework has been done in collaboration with a friend of mine, Armin Medosh, and if you're interested in it after you see a rather rapid presentation of it today, you can refer to the website that Armin has constructed for what he calls and what we call open source research, and you can actually subscribe to, you can become a member of the Technopolitics group, and if you do so, there's actually more texts that you have access to than if you simply browse the site, because the group, for some reason which I don't quite understand, is well, I guess the idea was the group, there's a lot, we produce a lot, and I do understand this reason. The idea was to not take over the entire site and drive everyone else out. So if you're specifically interested, all you have to do is sign up, it'll add you to the list, and you'll see kind of the development of these ideas. I'm going to present them to you right now. And this is more the kind of thing that I'm going to do. I don't need notes because I put everything up there, okay? So this begins with a guy you may have heard of, Kondrotiev. Nikolai Kondrotiev, a Russian and then Soviet economist who therefore did his work in the 1920s, produced ideas that excited the rivalry of Leon Trotsky, and who eventually was, pushed out. I forget whether he was. I think he might have been killed in the Stalinist purges, but I'm not really sure about that. So Google him or something. His basic insight came from data like this. These are U.S. wholesale prices, and you can see this cyclical thing going on here with three very clear peaks. Okay? Kondrotiev looked at data on prices, interest rates, wages, and foreign trade. This was the data they had at the time in France, England, and the USA. And then he could also look, basically because of the English Empire, at total coal and pig iron production in the world. He didn't at all have the kind of data that we have now, but those are the data that he used. He was able to identify, in around 1920, three long waves, rising from 1789 to a peak in 1814, then declining until 1848, rising to a peak in 1873, then declining until 1896, rising again to a peak sometime around 1920. He didn't know it, but it would continue to rise till 1929. Right? He obtained his curves. This is a statistical thing. What he did was he took data like this. Actually, most data is not even as rich. This one is remarkably, this one makes it obvious. Most of them, they go like this. And you have to apply statistical techniques to smooth out the curves and see what the average is. And when you do that, two things happen. One, you get amazing looking curves, and two, you can actually do anything you want with the data. So this does not, and I don't want you to think that I'm a numerologist. I don't necessarily believe this proves anything at all. But it did the discourse that I'm interested in, not only learning about but also constructing in my own way, begins with Kondrotiev, and there is something to it. It's in fact quite a stroke of genius that he identified this, and what's very interesting, but I'm not going to get into it, is that if you read Trotsky, you can see that Trotsky had the same ideas at the same time, and also said quite brilliant things about it. It's rather easy to find out on the net.
I just thought you might find it quite interesting. I remember this quite well, and after I had read this, after we had discussed this, I had come across an article that pointed me to a television interview. And the right wing in the United States has essentially attempted to appropriate Kondrotiev to justify the 99ers in the States, to ending unemployment, for ending any credits for anyone, to end any programs, to say that, well, it's going to crash anyway, so we may as well let these fail. You know what I'm talking about? So I just thought you might find that quite interesting. I thought that was quite interesting, because that's where we're going to go with it.
They will appropriate anything, you know,
yeah.
because they're the dominant. So he arrived at, the thing is, there are a lot of cycles in business. So you have like an intermediate cycle, which regular capitalists recognize, this like 7 to 11 year cycle. He tried to smooth that out, and his originality is to pull out a longer cycle, which is of a period of around 50 years. He says 45 to 60, I think is his notion. So as he wrote, the long ways really belong to the same complex dynamic process in which the intermediate cycles of the capitalistic economy, with their principal phases of upswing and depression, run their course. These intermediate cycles, however, secure a certain stamp, that is to say, they take on a particular character from the very existence of the long waves. Our investigation demonstrates that during the rise of the long waves, years of prosperity are more numerous, whereas years of depression predominate during the downswing. He observed that large numbers of technological inventions occurred during the depressions, but were only applied during the next expansion, and that's a crucial idea. He also thought that the most disastrous and extensive wars and revolutions happened on the upswing during the period of high tension in the expansion of economic forces. For Kondrotiev, the long waves arise out of causes that are inherent in the essence of the capitalistic economy. That's the point where Trotsky was totally objected to, and he said that the long waves exist, but they secure their character for political reasons because of human intervention. Trotsky, in other words, was totally against the idea of a mechanistic causality of these long waves of development. The bit about wars and revolutions occurring on the upswing, I'm honestly not so sure. The thing that I find really interesting is this observation that large numbers of technological inventions occurred during the depressions but were only applied at the next expansion. And that has been developed extensively by other people. That will be developed to give you this very simplified thing, which shows you different families of technologies that come to fruition during each of the long waves. The last one, of course, being information technology, which, as we see every day in the newspapers, is now in its decline, right? So what does that mean? Here's something a little more immediate, a little more precise. It starts with, this is a group of analysts, which are kind of loosely known as the Innovation School. Probably the major book is this one, The Economics of Industrial Innovation. I haven't been able to get a PDF of it, unfortunately. They have done very interesting work, beginning with Schumpeter, who was an economist of the period of the 30s and the Second World War period. So Schumpeter, this is a quote from the Economics of Industrial Innovation. In his major work on business cycles, published in 1939, Schumpeter accepted the reality of Kondrotiev long cycles and offered a novel explanation of them. He believed that the task of economic theory was to analyze those features of the system's behavior which generate fluctuations, irrespective of their specific and variable form. The most important of such features was innovation, which he saw as the main engine of capitalist growth and the source of entrepreneurial profit. This is the great idea of Schumpeter is that innovation is what drives the economy, and it's both technological innovation but also entrepreneurial innovation. That is to say, the creation of new business processes, of new marketing processes, of new financial processes, and so on. And so he sees a link between the two things. The technological innovation is in a way necessary but not sufficient. You also have the entrepreneurial innovation, and then when the conditions are right and capitalists are not afraid to invest money, you can then have the rising of a wave in which a new technology will go from a position of being a mere invention, something that a scientist made possible, to an innovation, that is to say, something which is put into production and comes to shape the actual conditions of life on the planet, as every one of these technologies have. So by studying that, just to continue with the quote, Schumpeter and Schumpeter's idea, the ability and initiative of entrepreneurs created new opportunities for profit, which in turn attracted a swarm of imitators and improvers to exploit the new opening with a wave of new investment generating boom conditions. This became interesting to me because I lived through such a wave of new investment. We had these things lying around for years. It was clear that there was a lot of innovation in computer technology, and it's clear that there's a really strong amount of innovation in the 1970s, which was a prolonged recession, practically a depression. No? And then what happened? We saw in the United States the computerization of society during the 1980s, so that it began to go into production under the impulse of the government, who also knows these theories very well, and was trying to create this new economy based on computers. Then came 1989, and suddenly the floodgates were open. And what I lived through and was conscious of was the transformation of the world because of massive investments of capital into the production, not only of computers, which were already being produced, but also of networks, the laying of cables across the earth, the construction of the capacity in every country to have internet connections and to develop them for all their worth, that is to say, to set up new kinds of business, to use new organizational models, and so on and so on. This was vertiginous in the experience of the 1990s, about which many people no doubt become nostalgic because it was a very exciting time, and so on and so on, whatever. But it's something where, having lived through that, and then I came across this material and I thought, this is true. This is clearly true. And then you look into the history. And so you start to see these waves which can be identified by kind of basic things like textiles, mills. This was the dark satanic mills of Blake's time. It was basically water power to produce spun cotton with machines. First industrial revolution. Then came steam power and railways. You see, the steam engine had been invented this time, but it only became really big in the second wave from the 1840s to 90s. Third, an age of electricity and steel, from which we get someone very famous, Joe Stalin, and steel itself, right? I mean, and this massive development of electricity, which replaces the very polluting steam power, and the old thing which you can still see when you go around in upstate New York or such places, which are places which is fantastic. They reached their industrial peak in the 1840s, 50s, and so on. And you see these buildings where they had the water wheel and a long axis, and then all the machines were turned by belts, right? So by the time you got to the age of electricity and steel, you have little electric motors everywhere. Much easier to work with, much higher productivity, much more, and so on and so on and so on. The one that formed the generation, in many ways, the norms of our society, is what Ulrich Beck calls the zombie categories of contemporary society: Fordism, mass production, conveyor belt, and so on. Obviously invented not in the 1940s, but in around 1910, which came to its total saturation of the world economic space in the period of the Second World War onward, after the crisis of the 1930s. And then finally, fifth, this book was written I think in the early 90s. At the time, they were still placing a question mark around the age of microelectronics and computer networks. There is no more question mark anymore. This was another huge phase of development. And so, you've already, I suppose, scanned all this stuff, so you see that, there are different forms of transportation and communication that are associated with, and are even in many ways the mainstay. I mean, if the mainstay of mass production is the car, how can you dissociate the car from the motor highway? If the mainstay of the fifth Kondrotiev way, this microelectronics. How can you dissociate that from the networks, from digital networks? And then this one is interesting because, of course, we've never managed to get beyond oil here, so the same energy system. And then they talk about universal and cheap key factors. Steel, the railways depended on iron, but steel is an alloy of iron, which made many different, trains became faster, ships, steel ships became practical, iron was used to clad wooden ships for wartime, but steel ships really changed, and so these things, basically the age of electronics begins, as I'll mention later on, in the 1970s, when the microchip is invented, and then Moore's law makes it cheaper and bigger and cheaper and bigger, right? So it's these universal factors of production that contribute to the long ways. Now, you can go further with that. You can ask this question: whether such a theory of technological change offers a plausible explanation of long ways in economic development depends, crucially, on whether some innovations are so large and so discontinuous in their impact as to cause prolonged perturbations, or, that's one possibility, that the innovation is so great that it marks a break, or, the second possibility, whether they're bunched together in some way, whether you have a lot of innovations that come together to form a qualitatively distinct way of producing, of distributing and of using, material production. The construction of a national railway network, for example, might be the type of innovation investment which would qualify as a wave generator in its own right. What matters for a major upswing and transformation of the economy in terms of new investment and employment is the widespread diffusion of numerous innovations based on a new infrastructure. The previous gestation period for this new infrastructure and a corresponding cluster of innovations can be several decades. Thus, whereas Schumpeter spoke of the innovations in automobile production, and especially the internal combustion engine in the period from the 1880s to the 1940s, we take the age of mass production and the universal use of the automobile as the fourth Kondrotiev way, and not the third. So what he's saying is that you have innovations, I just said this a moment ago, but it's only when they come together to form a system that they start to really proliferate. And that system is not just the technological innovations, it's also the organizational pattern, it's also the way that things will be used, and it's the infrastructure that makes the innovation usable. You can have a computer, but it's not the same thing to have a computer as it is to have a computer that you can plug into the World Wide Web. I had computers like this in the 1980s. They just sat there on the table and I typed with them. When the cable started to be laid, and crucially when the HTTP protocol was brought in, the computer became an entirely different object. And of course it's at that point that you went, I'll answer your question in just a second, that you went from this period, which is the period, say, where the depression is, where the wave has reached its high point. Notice that it doesn't really fall. Basically it reaches a plateau and starts to stagnate. And that stagnate is what capitalism considers a repression, a recession or even a depression, because capitalism needs growth. So you have a point of stagnation, and at that point, innovations build up, and then there's, when a certain crucial threshold is passed, then they start to surge. And so this is a model from another important thinker in this tradition. I mean, if you can call that a thinker, I don't know. I mean, it's not a philosopher, that's for sure. This guy, Gerhard Mensch. I always try to put the covers of the books up. That way, if you're interested, you can look at it. So his idea is this stalemate in technology. His question is whether the depressions of 50, 100, and 150 years ago have something in common, and if so, what? And then this is his claim: the common denominator is the economic stagnation of major lines of business and the predominant technologies. So you reach a stalemate where it's flat. The line becomes flat. And so what happens? The car doesn't disappear, hardly. But it's not this sector that's going to create growth in the capitalist economy. Now I explain the whole thing. There are two questions. Yours first and then yours.
wondering, I mean, what about the notion of profitability? I mean, because you said...
this is the essence of the question. The essence, when I say stagnate, that means that you no longer have profit being generated. You have tremendous, I mean, car production is everywhere, right? It's in Brazil, it's in China, it's in India, and that's exactly the problem. That the leading sectors of the capitalist economy are no longer to extract from automobile production that excess of profit, which is the very essence of accumulation.
But in the case of cars and oil, the technology is there and has been there for a long time to do with that oil. So this is a case in which the technology is here, but we're not going for it for whatever reason, because maybe of the oil lobbies, I don't know. But do you know where I'm going?
Well, I don't think you're really seeing it right. The production of cars has just continued to expand, but it isn't very profitable. Look at GM, for instance. In America, I mean, America has been the center of, for the last 75 years of the capitalist economy. American automobile industry has gone nowhere.
Right. The
industries that have gone somewhere are the networked industries and what they make possible, finance. You see, and then what comes after that, the whole mode of what David Harvey calls flexible accumulation, which we'll get to. So what happens is that these waves don't really, if you look really hard, you might still find some steam and water power in use. You obviously find a lot of steel production, and oil is obviously a big thing. Obviously, if here we're on the fourth one, you have cars, and then here, so none of those things disappear, although the really old ones do start to disappear.
So, for example, if you take all the economy, what Obama calls the green economy, or for whatever reason, the green technology, if you will, has been around for a while.
But this is the point, my friend. This is what I'm trying to get at, and what Mensch is trying to get at. He says the innovations happen here, but this line could even be extended back.
Right.
But there are particular conditions that are required for that to become the focus of an economic surge. And those conditions are that basically what you have around every 50 years is something like what we're in right now, a major recession, perhaps even a depression. Under those conditions, science and technology do not stop, but what does stop is investment. So you can have an invention, and there are some important inventions in terms of so-called green ecology, but you've never had a burst of investment comparable to the one that just recently was put into networks. We've not had that. There are many people who would like for that to happen, but it's hard to. I mean, the whole point of all this thing is to coax the next wave into existence. They did it with information technology. Because these ideas about long waves have been used by governments now for many, many years. And it took great military investment on the part of the United States to start that thing rolling, and then it did. And what do you know, it worked. So these things, I mean, this is not an obscure, small, leftist understanding of the economy. This is actually a pretty, it's not mainstream because, Joe Blow, in France, the United States, doesn't have a clue about this and thinks that he should work for GM like his father and his grandfather did. But a lot of planners have this. Okay, so we'll talk more about your questions after. I want to make sure to get through. Short questions.
Short question, yes. I have a hypothetical question. I like this idea about the second paradigm, where a whole bunch of factors come together, the social infrastructure becomes reflexive, and therefore a new wave can be generated. My question is this: what if in two completely different sectors of the economy this was to happen at the same time? Could that process actually change the entire wave model?
Well, I have no idea. I mean, the model is just a model. It's not a causal thing, but an attempt at a posteriori explanation. What seems to happen, or what's useful about this model, is it allows you to see how different factors cohere. And that is what I'm about to talk about. That's where the utility of the model comes in. Because we see that certain periods, the periods between the major recessions or depressions, start to take on a character of systematicity. Things start to work together. There is a synergistic effect. And these things are not just technologies. And they're not just organizational forms or business models. And they're not just the associated financing models. They're also factors that have to do with the way society and culture, too, operate. The way
it's not deterministic.
No, it's not deterministic. It's an attempt to understand why it is that a period feels like a period, and why it is that people realize that there are these kind of synergistic effects where, because things are happening, are working well, and things are meshing with each other, an entrepreneur can go and do something new. You know, I mean, it's because of the kind of growth of the '90s and globalization that a particularly brilliant sort of entrepreneur named Wolfgang and his colleagues were able to start this, right? Because they saw, oh, you have mobile people, it's a knowledge economy, you can run a network thing, and that's an example of one among many, many people who see how things are working and strike out, take a risk and do something, which is interesting. I mean, of course it's interesting because you start to understand, I mean, we live in these capitalist economies, there's obviously for better and worse in there, and it's interesting how people are able to do that. They're able to do those sort of things as many Bill Gates or whatever is able to do during these upswings. Something that you can't really do during the periods of stagnation. And so the point is to try to understand how it is that the different elements that achieve a good fit start to work together and produce a kind of particular tone, a particular type of society. I'm about to get to that in a much more complex way, but I just wanted to point out, because this will become more important later on, that there are emergent forms. And if you look, this is another version of the same table we looked at before, but if you look specifically on column 6, where you see that they point out that there are other sectors which grow rapidly from a small base. So that in the third Kondrotiev wave, known as the Belle Epoque or whatever, you have electrical and heavy engineering being prominent, steel and electricity, but you also have all these things being invented: automobiles, aircraft, telecommunications, radio. I mean, as a matter of fact, even TV was invented. Aluminum, consumer durables, oil, and plastics were all invented at that time, but they weren't produced. They became the mainstays of the fourth wave, the mainstays. So it's not the invention that counts, it's the way it comes together to form a society that counts. So what I say, this table shows how the major technologies and organizational forms of each age are supplemented by an emergent set of inventions, only some of which will become central in the following period. So if you have two innovations, perhaps one will not become central. There are some that don't. There are inventions that go nowhere, but some of them will become central in the following period. The same is true, this is also true for information age technologies, which emerged out of the crucible of the Second World War, as we will see extensively tomorrow, but which became central in the neoliberal phase, which is the phase that we're still in. Okay, now we can make this much, much more interesting. Because if you add to these theories, the theories of what's called the École de la Régulation, or in English this is known as the regulation approach, you start to see that it's not only a matter of technology and business models. That would be a very boring vision of society, a very one-dimensional vision of society, and certainly one that I would not present to you as useful for understanding anything. But this approach actually meshes very well with the highly sophisticated model of society, which is the model of the regulation school. Its chief exponents are Alieta, who's the inventor, a guy named Boyer, also Lippietz, and there are a few more, kind of the Parisian school. There's also a Grenoble school. It's primarily known in the Anglo-Saxon world through one of David Harvey's books, a great one called The Condition of Postmodernity. But in fact, there is a strong exponent of the Anglo-Saxon exponent of the regulation school, which is Bob Jessup, who I happen to quite like as a sociologist. So this is Jessup's summary. The regulation school wants to know about the same problem. Essentially, they want to know, why is it that after the Second World War, everything came together into this sustained period of growth, which also produced the welfare state, where at last workers were cut into the deal, not only in terms of being able to consume, but also in terms of having access to a number of social institutions, which were socialized health care, the thing we dream about in the United States, public education, the thing that we're losing everywhere in the world, right? Vacation time, leisure, and the actual creation of public facilities for leisure, something which under neoliberalism is totally commodified. Why was it that in this post-war period there was able to form a social system that could associate sustained growth in the capitalist economy with a number of social advantages that seemed to further sustain that growth? And for a while even seemed to eliminate those 7 to 11 year cycles that made capitalism such a chaotic thing, which is now what we know constantly because all of us have lived through crash after crash after crash. That was attenuated during what the French called the Trente Glorieuses, or what in English we call the post-war boom. And the regulation school wanted to know why. The reason they wanted to know why is because the post-war boom came to an end. And that's when it became very interesting for economists and sociologists to ask on what was this paradigm founded and what could be the conditions for the emergence of a new stabilization or regulation of capital. How can it be brought into a balance? And so they use basic concepts. The concepts of industrial paradigm, which we've already come across, of the accumulation regime, of the mode of regulation, and the mode of development. 4 basic concepts. First, an industrial paradigm is a model governing the technical and social division of labor. One such paradigm is mass production. That's what we've just talked about. The technical division of labor, but also the social division of labor. Second, an accumulation regime is a complementary pattern of production and consumption that is reproducible over a long period. So this is where the production has to be good for something. It has to match the needs of people. It has to keep people alive, you know? That's also fundamental. You can produce things, we seem to be headed for this now, you can produce things which do not keep people alive. So there has to be a fit between production and consumption. This is always about a fit, you know. Third, a mode of regulation. This is obviously where it gets interesting. An ensemble of norms, institutions, organizational forms, social networks, and patterns of conduct. That means behavior. That can also mean culture, you know. Patterns of conduct that can temporarily stabilize an accumulation regime despite the conflictual and antagonistic character of capitalist social relations. I think that's a big one, though. What that means, you know, capitalist social relations, you can see it today, are conflictual. It's not easy to live in these capitalist societies. What are people doing now in London? They're burning the place up. What's happening? 20,000 cops out on the street. Why are those cops out on the street? Because the people who are lighting fire to certain buildings can't get a job, they can't get enough to survive. They have to look at the opulent wealth of the people in the financial sector in the city of London. And they have to suffer the racism that comes out in the European societies, as in the North American ones, whenever there occurs a downswing of the economy. And those downswings in an unregulated economy like the neoliberal economy become sharper and sharper and sharper, as they have been doing since the mid-90s, since the Asian crisis of 1997 and 1998. You have crash after crash after crash, and finally it comes to the heartland and it actually strikes Main Street in the United States, and you know this is big, right? And it's so big that now the European governments and the euro is tottering, and the United States debt is downgraded, and so on and so on. So capitalism is a chaotic and conflictual regime. How is it stabilized, at least temporarily? They say that you can analyze this mode of regulation in terms of 5 different dimensions. So a wage relation, how people are paid, what constitutes a condition that's acceptable both to the employer and the employee. So labor markets, wage bargaining, individual social wage, and social wages, that is to say the wage that an individual gets, but also the kind of social wages, that means the kind of payments for retirement, for unemployment, and so on. And then the lifestyles, that consumption styles that can go with that. That's one dimension that has to come into harmony. Another dimension is the form of the business. Its internal organization, whether a hierarchy or in the past or a network today, where it's really getting its profit from, because not every aspect of the business is profitable. Today, many businesses get most of their profit from their financial arm. General Electric, for instance, makes more money off money than it does off light bulbs, or nuclear power plants, which is the big thing that it builds. forms of competition, the way they struggle each other, on what grounds. Today you struggle to be faster, to be more responsive to the marketplace. In the past you struggled to be bigger and to inundate the marketplace with one product that made all the others obsolete. So these things change. Ties among enterprises and banking capital. Then the kind of money, it would be surprising to you to know that money is not the same in the different historical periods. The money of the post-war period, and I'll talk about this more tomorrow, is not at all the same kind of money that we have now. Our money now is primarily electronic, and it exists not only as money, but it also exists as associated derivatives, as associated speculative bets on this or that. It exists in a constant fluctuation between the euro, the yen, the dollar, and the rest, all of that fluctuating. So money is not the same. So there's a form of money. Its dominant form, the way it's created, the way it's emitted, the organization of the banks, which obviously has changed a huge amount, the way that money capital is allocated to production, in this case through speculative finance that gives money for certain kinds of production, that raises it from people's savings and concentrates it for certain kinds of production. This circulation and articulation of national monies, one of the most complicated things there is, except for the weather, because you have those different currencies I was just talking about. And basic institutional features of monetary regimes. That means what, in our case, that means what the European Central Bank or the G8 try to figure out to patch up the crisis that they can't stop. In the past, it meant, and we'll talk about this tomorrow, it meant something called Bretton Woods, which was a very strong, very stable, and very extensive international monetary regime, whereby money was a very different beast than it is today. It was stable. Today, a dollar bought as many francs as it would a month later, a year later, and even 10 years later, with very small fluctuation that itself was controlled and debated in the IMF. Then, of course, the form of the state. We're going to see that the state itself changes. It's not the same state. The neoliberal state is vastly different from the Fordist state. And finally, the international regimes. The emergence of the WTO in the 1990s was the one that probably everyone remembers. Big change in the institutionality of capital. So all these things come together more or less. The thing that the regulation school really brought out, I think, was that in neoliberalism they never came together as they had during Keynesian Fordism. And what's even one of the limits of the regulation school is they always thought, we're going to manage in France to get these things together. And there was a guy named Lionel Jospin who really thought he could do it. And at that time, Monsieur Alietta was the counselor of, the economic advisor of Lionel Jospin, and they thought that within the hexagon, they could put it all together and stabilize capitalism. Boy, were they wrong. They were so wrong. The euro came along, and the entire sovereignty of France, disappeared. Jospin did not get elected president, and we have what we have. In other words, the impossibility for neoliberalism to really produce a regulation of these different factors. But we have some kind of regulation. We have a regulation which does work. Globalization is not nothing. It's a vast, vast thing. And I got here like that, right? I organized all my tickets on the internet. I landed in Paris. I took the train the next day. I even had the ticket for the bus, when I got to Saas-Fee, right? So there's something that works here. The thing is that it works only for certain people. There's lots of people who are really left in the lurch, especially when it comes to this. And to this, which is not working very well at all right now. And in fact, as we're going to see more and more, and as you see in the paper every day, this is not working particularly well right now either. Money is not looking very good at the moment. So, finally, the notion of the mode of development, which is the biggest concept of the regulation school. Boyer defines it as the way in which an accumulation regime and a type of regulation, you must say, stabilize themselves over the long term, and how they enter into a period of crisis and then renew themselves. The thing that interests me and the whole Italian Autonomie school so much. A similar concept, so that's the mode of development. How an accumulation regime and a type of regulation start to stabilize in themselves and produce a long-term formation until they enter into a crisis when all the different parts that seem to work together start to divide. That's a mode of development. Now, Lippietz takes and makes that into a political concept, where he talks not about a mode of development, but a model of development. Of course, that's very interesting, because then you're not just trying to describe what happened in the past, but you're trying to project into the future what should be the mode of development. So the concept of a model of development is a political concept. The concept of a mode of development is an analytic concept. That may seem like a small distinction, but it's not. If you try to create a new model of development, it means you want to steer society in a different direction. That's a prospective way of looking at things. If you try to analyze a mode of development, you're looking at the past. I was associated for quite a while with the journal Multitude in France, because I used to live there. And we were really trying to propose a model of development. And these were very interesting times with Jospin and with that after this 1995 strike. There was a long time where people really believed, hoped, and tried to create a model of development that would actually do what the regulation school was kind of asking for, that is, say, bring these factors into play and get them to start to work. And that would mean that, for instance, the driving force of the neoliberal period, information technology, would no longer just disrupt life, throw people out of work, create a kind of cultural chaos, but instead would come into some kind of sustainable harmony, right? So there's a whole, different people proposed different concepts. Many people did. These were very interesting times. I think they are now definitively over. Now what we face is a major crisis of capitalism. There is no hope to turn neoliberal informationalism into a survivable social system. What it's going to happen is it's moving into a period of stagnation, which may or may not be accompanied by violence. It is already accompanied by certain levels of violence. The notion of a model of development could now come into play in a different way when we try to look beyond the period of crisis that we're in now and try to look for the period that not only will I live through, but you will very much live through, because you'll probably live through the whole period, whereas I'll probably just live through the emergence of it, which is going to be a tough one. The whole point of this kind of analysis is obviously not just to analyze, you must analyze the mode of development, but obviously the point is to think about the model of development.
This is a question I think about a lot, about what you were just saying. Is this a crisis of capitalism itself, or is it, is there any hope left?
Well, of course there's. I mean, if you look back to this thing, I mean, according to the way these people think, there's always just another wave, There's always just another wave. Of course, they don't include the ecological crisis in here. I do. Yeah. But so there's something to that. Capitalism will endure. Yeah. How it will endure is the question.
My question is if you could elaborate just a little bit on why you think that possibility is over.
Oh, because it's clearly, it's been long enough. Basically, the current sort of wave, began in the early 70s. That's when the microprocessor was invented. You had those inventions start to accumulate, and then you had this investment, this surge of investment beginning in the 80s in the US and then globalizing in the 90s. That has reached a period of stagnation now. The information technology is not going to go away, but it's no longer going to produce vast profit for capitalism. What is happening is that the arrival of information technology has generated conditions in the world where the current international hierarchy is no longer sustainable. Just as in the 70s, it was no longer possible to have the US up here, and even the Europeans and the Japanese down here, and the rest of the people actually in an imperialist situation. Okay? After 1968, that was no longer sustainable. Capitalism changed, became neoliberal. Now we're in a situation where you can see that the people in China, the people in India, and as we've seen so dramatically in the last months, the people in the Middle East no longer can accept to be on the edges of the current capitalist system. So socially, you have a major problem. You can see that the articulation of money, the attempt to turn information technology, which is basically a thing of communication, into the mainstay of production, is not working. You can't base capitalism on a mode of communication. There has to be some kind of production there, and it has to be somewhat beneficial as well. The way that information, there were great hopes for a knowledge society and so on. What we have is not a knowledge society, otherwise people would be reciting Shakespeare in the street and not looking at the Financial Times. What we have is a financialized society, and that's what we're talking about in this class. So the promise, the possibility to create a viable model of development out of informationalism, I think we must accept, despite all the great things, I mean, I personally love the internet, despite all the great things about it, we have not been able to do that. The reason why seems to be that it takes a real crisis. So it may be that what we're in, and this is actually what I think, is that we're in a regulation crisis of informationalism. And that perhaps even as, Fordism, Ford arose and people started to produce in factories, and then they found out they could produce guns and tanks and airplanes in factories, and then you had a nasty, nasty regulation crisis called the Second World War. And as that came out, there was a stabilization, and the factory system could spread everywhere with what they call harmony. Now we have a situation where information technology has had a first run, a first wave. None of its problems have been solved, and we are entering a crisis. And this crisis is not just economic, but also diplomatic, military, and ecological. What will happen in this crisis is the question of all of our collective existence. And that's why it's interesting. This is just the beginning of an approach to this. We'll continue talking about this. I do want to finish this bit. So what we're doing in this research project is we're trying to, first of all, analyze the mode of development. So we came up with 4 categories to try to make that simpler. What's been primary for Marx, the productive process, into which you can place the whole technology thing we just talked about, the organizational forms that Schumpeter talks about, market structures, financing, all that you can place in here. Another category called the integrative process, where you can talk about wages, but also about the forms of consumption, also about the institutions of care, that whole thing of welfare, schooling, retirement, healthcare, all these institutions. The forms of administration and justice. I think actually I was really trying to think law here, but somehow it became administration. And then you can go even further and think about the core values, where you could even put aesthetics. Eh? You have a further category which becomes viciously complex, but very important, global protocols. We're big geeks, we got the idea of protocols from, IP protocols, stuff like that. But it really is talking about monetary protocols, military protocols, technoscientific, the way the worldwide scientific community creates norms and standards, trade regulation and migration regimes, all the things that now are really coming into this disorder, but which worked to get me from the Pennsylvania woods to South Fe in 2 days in other words, these global protocols are very strong. The creation of norms and standards has been tremendous and is really the key factor of globalization. Trade regulation has obviously been a key factor of globalization. The military strategies as well, even though they look so horrible. But so, finally, a 4th category we wanted to put in there: agents of change. Who are they? The grassroots, the people. Vanguards, the idea of the Leninist Party, the idea of the artistic vendor. So, in other words, intentional groups, power elites, which we see a lot of these days, acting. I mean, if Goldman Sachs isn't an agent of change, I don't know what they are. And inventor and entrepreneurs. You could probably extend each of these categories by 1 or 2, but we decided we had a nice complex system there, and divided into 4 categories. There's a reason for that I'll get to at the end of this class. And there you have it, the secret life of waves. One of the things we want to do and have not done yet is to put all this into an archive where you can access these different things also on a timeline. This is like the kind of fantasy that researchers get when they devise a project. I don't know if we'll ever manage to do this, where you could simply, you would be in the agents of change, one of these things, and we would get articles and books and analyses and so on. But nonetheless, when we set out to make this, my idea was that from this you can create cultural critique. And that's what I've been doing for the last couple of years, and that's what this course comes out of, is from this analysis. Because if you start to look at things in this way, you can find patterns that you were not able to find if you didn't have this sort of analytic structure that gives you a way to outline a mode of development.
Just out of curiosity, with those, I mean, I don't know if it's an accent, but the way I wrote it down, it's really curious. Is it, Guattari was a Lacanian initially, right? You just read Guattari?
Yeah.
was Lacanian, right? He basically just got rid of prohibition and all that, but he nonetheless maintains, essentially, like he'll maintain the graph and the idea of the box, and even I think some of the symbols do that, right?
Yes.
Is it possible to map those four onto S1, S2, bar subject and name?
It's certainly not, well, I mean, I'm not a Lacanian, so it's certainly, you can do whatever you want, but I wouldn't do it. However, Guattari, was a member of the École Freudienne,
No, that's why
Guattari was a Lacanian.
It does come out of Lacan, right?
Yeah, Guattari is a
Some
Lacanian
big
psychologist. However, Guattari is much more interesting than the majority of Lacanian psychologists you will meet, psychotherapists. I mean, much more interesting because Guattari was interested in society. He was a communist, He was a technologist. He was a social theorist. And so Guattari has four categories that I think you can map these onto, and I'm going to show that at the end when I talk about Guattari. When we designed this, my friend doesn't like Guattari, so I don't say anything about Guattari, but I said, why don't we have four categories?
but just
It makes things a lot more interesting.
just a note, that it's just an anecdote, but if you're a Lacanian, you're by definition a communist.
Maybe. I just don't know. I mean, I'm interested in Lacan through Guattari. I think Lacan has done great things, obviously.
Give the man his props.
Yeah, of course. But like Lacan would not. There's no Lacanian that's developing this kind of thing because they're not interested in social science. Whereas Guattari was very interested in social science, and that's why I think it's something you can build on. If you're just interested in psychodynamics, Lacan can be great. But if you want to know really something about the way that politics and economics works, you need to be interested in the social sciences in a way that doesn't always bring it back to the structure of the subject in relation to the other. Because there are more things at play than that. And there are these things. I think that Lacan, I'm afraid, fits into some of these aspects here, Now, I'm going to continue. Please write your questions down and say them. I want to just finish the thing here, and then that way we'll have time and we won't be under some sort of pressure that we won't have time to finish. There's just actually one more little development here, which is this. What I'm going to be doing, in the same way that I develop for you the notion of an interaction, of a disciplinary diagram and an interaction diagram, I want to develop over the next 5 minutes the beginnings of the notion of the change between Fordism and informationalism. And to do that, I'm going to again call upon Bob Jessup, who himself has called upon Michel Ayeta, especially this great book, Theory of Capitalist Regulation, written in 1976, which goes to show you that a real social scientist does not wait for the dust to settle before creating his theory, because it was clear that the Fordist mode of production had entered its crisis in 1973. He published his book in 1976. That's not bad. His book is like that. So it took that long to write it. Great. It's great stuff. And so what I want to do is just present the way that Jessup has contrasted what he calls the Keynesian welfare national state with a second figure, which will correspond to informationalism. He gives you, again, actually 4 different things, although they're not quite the same things. He says that the KWNS was Keynesian insofar as it aimed to secure full employment in what was treated as a relatively closed national economy, so spatial closure, and to do so primarily through demand-side management. In other words, you make sure people have enough money to buy the goods. That way the goods can continue to be produced. The KWNS, the Keynesian Welfare National State, attempted to adjust effective demand, the key concept of Keynes, effective demand, to the supply-driven needs of Fordist mass production, with its dependence on economies of scale, if Ford has to be big, and full utilization of relatively inflexible means of production. It's big and it has to be programmed. So for that, you can't, when you sunk all that money into huge factories, you can't suddenly have people with no money to buy, otherwise your factory collapses. It's so big it must continue to produce and produce, and for that you need this thing called effective demand, which is, by the way, what will integrate the proletariat into the capitalist state and end the problem of the Bolshevik Revolution. That was what Keynes really wanted to do, was save capitalism from itself. So the Keynesian welfare national state was oriented to welfare, insofar as it tried to regulate collective bargaining within limits consistent with full employment levels of growth. to generalize norms of mass consumption beyond male workers earning a family wage in 40 sectors, so that all full national citizens and their family dependents, if any, might share in the fruits of economic growth and thereby contribute to effective domestic demand. In other words, the welfare state was supposed to get everybody into the pie and make everybody productive and consumptive, you know, and to promote forms of collective consumption favorable to the forwardist mode of growth. So go to the movies, get a hamburger and so on, and go drive a car. This is reflected in indicators such as increasing rates for unemployment benefits, sickness benefit, and pensions during the heyday of the Keynesian welfare nations. And generally, the economic and social rights attached directly or indirectly to citizenship of a national territorial state, whether citizenship is based on descent and cultivation and political test or some other criterion. In other words, citizenship was a big thing, and you can see that now this is much less important, right? It was national, insofar as the national territorial state assumed the primary responsibility for developing and guiding Keynesian welfare policies. This reflects the more general importance of national economies and national states in the 30 glorious years of post-war growth. For the national, not only dominated the circuits of Atlantic forwardism, but also the mercantilist regimes or trading nations of East Asia and the import substitution accumulation strategies of many Latin American countries. This is important because you see the nation was a much more important container in the period of your grandfathers and my parents. It was a container in which you could organize social relations. You can see now that, for instance, in Europe, this is finished. There is no way to organize social relations. The state can do nothing. If it tries to spend, Standard & Poor's will downgrade its note, right? I mean, there is no social policy under the neoliberal Europe. So this national thing has clearly gone out, right? I mean, as many other things. So, and finally, the Keynesian welfare national state was statist insofar as state institutions were the chief complement to market forces. Primacy of the state. The idea that the state can control the national territory, create the rights of citizenship, and thereby create effective demand to keep the industry, the Fordist industry, turning, to keep those big wheels of Fordist industry turning. Then you get into what he calls, in these mouthful terms, the Schumpeterian workfare post-national regime. Whoa. But this is the one we live in. And so it's Schumpeterian for all the reasons that I said, because it tries to promote innovation and flexibility. Schumpeter clearly became the dominant economist of the neoliberal period. All the talk about entrepreneurialism derives from Schumpeter, who believed, in creative destruction. It was his major concept, and which any businessman, dancing on the point of their polished shoes will tell you is the cat's meow of existence, right? I mean, you destroy vast sectors because it gives you the chance to create new ones, What an opportunity. The banks in the recent financial crisis are Schumpeterian to the core. They are taking advantage to let the small ones wither away and to capture huge markets so that pretty soon you will have 10 global banks in the same way that you have 10 global automobile producers. Something that you did not have. So, innovation and flexibility. I don't want to read all this stuff because it's long and I don't have the PDF. It can be described as a workfare regime insofar as it subordinates social policy to the demands of economic policy. Indicated under this rubric of economic policy are the promotion of labor market flexibility and employability, the development of the new globalizing knowledge-based economy, and the cultivation of structural and or systemic competitiveness, the mantra of the European Union and of course of the US since forever. It is worth repeating here that the scope of economic policy has been massively widened and deepened because of the increased importance of capital accumulation of what was previously regarded as being extra-economic. In other words, to think that your vacation, that your marriage, that your children were economic factors. Now there's a business to address all those things, obviously to address every trouble of your mind, your heart, and your gonads, and all of that costs money. And you can buy insurance, which is derived from financial products, and so on and so on and so on. So every aspect of life, including your fantasies and your dreams, your fantasies are heavily, marketized these days, is marketized. Under the Keynesian model, there's the idea that when you're sick, you need care. And this is not part of the economy. Everyone, as a citizen, has a right to that care. When you're young, you need education. Everyone has a right to that education. They don't have to put their life in hock for that. They don't have to enter into a financial relationship to have their education completed. Under the Schumpeterian, this model, workfare post-national regime, you have everything being marketized. And that contributes to all of our personalities. Of course, it produces what I call the flexible personality. The Schumpeterian workfare post-national regime is obviously post-national. I don't think it has to be said. Other horizons of action, it doesn't have to be said, we're all here. Which make the national economy less susceptible to macroeconomic management because they just leave, and so do you, and so do we. I mean, I did it. I spent 20 years in France. The national territory less important as a power container. A nation no longer succeeds by keeping all its citizens within its borders. It succeeds by arming them for the global competition and then trying to make them somehow loyal to extended networks which have something to do with the US. They could be IBM, they could be Goldman Sachs, and so on. All those techniques of corporations. You know, corporations are still somehow national in their identity, but they're not national in their base. They are transnational. What's been curious is that they remain national in their identity. In the 90s, we thought corporations were going to become totally transnational. There was a corporation called ABB. It started out as Swedish. It became Swiss, I believe. It creates massive engineering projects for marine transport and other things. This we thought would be the model of the corporation, totally transnational. It hasn't really turned out to be true. But the citizens, the people who run those corporations, themselves have become tremendously transnational. They tend increasingly to speak several languages. They tend to be familiar with the world, able to navigate different cultures. They are coached in that, they're schooled in that, and so on and so on and so on. I'm going to develop all these things to much greater extent. And then the institutionality, obviously. The role of the IMF and the World Bank has transformed to become, the IMF and the World Bank used to be applied to what were called at the time third world countries. Then, in what year? 1976. In what country? Great Britain became the first one to receive a structural adjustment policy in Europe. Now we have a structural adjustment policy being carried out by the European Central Bank on the whole European space. Now we're having a massive structural adjustment of the US, where the idea is that, listen kids, you have to get to work again, and for that you're just going to have to be poor for a while, because that's the only way we know to kick you in the ass and make you work. So these transnational institutions have become much, much more important under this post-national regime. And then finally, it's no longer really about statism, and these two things are obviously connected. And when it says regime-like, that means that the global protocols have become so important. It's no longer an arena in which nation-states regulate their military and monetary conflicts. It's an arena in which social norms are created at a global level. And so that is a regime in that it has to do with operating rules rather than political frameworks. And so I think that in every respect, I mean, I really think that this schema here is very abstract. And it's very much the thing of a sociologist who tries to use these incredibly inclusive, detailed, large concepts. But I think what we're going to do tomorrow is dig into this and look at it in granular detail and try to feel these things. Try to make them exist in the body, in the aesthetic horizon, in the tone, and try and see how you can look. I'm going to try to isolate two figures. A figure of a technocratic planner, characteristic of the post-war Keynesian national welfare state, and a figure created by a guy named Robert Reich of the symbolic analyst, which would be characteristic of neoliberal informationalism or of what Jessup calls Schumpeterian for post-nationalism. And I'm going to do that by looking at the kind of technologies that develop, at the kind of industries and entrepreneurial strategies, organizational forms that develop, at the kinds of cultural forms that develop, and see how those are incarnated in a couple of individuals, as a matter of fact, two individuals. And in between those two figures, obviously, I'm going to look a bit rapidly, perhaps, at the crisis of '68 and of the late '60s and early '70s. and try and give you a feeling for how this neoliberal informationalism emerged. Because what we've learned from history is that the characteristics of the period we live in have a lot to do with what happened in the preceding crisis. This is something that Toni Negri and Paolo Virno and so on, they lived through those things as political figures. And so they are extremely, extremely aware that the actions that they took during the 60s and 70s, you know, what happened at the end of the 70s? The state put him in jail. And Virno told this to me once. He said, we came out of jail and we saw that society had entirely changed. And we wanted to take our revenge, but to do it, we had to entirely change our theories. And so they worked in the 80s, and by the mid-90s, they had this new theory of, which gave rise to, you know, books like Empire and Multitude, and gave rise to a vast set of practices, especially here in Europe, of contestatory practices, of dissenting practices, which are the kind of things that I happen to love and that I spend a good 10 years engaging in at every possible opportunity, and also theorizing. Because, and to do that, both the practice and the theory required understanding how the moves that were made in the late 60s and throughout the 70s entered into the sort of general social mill and came out as a new set of regularities, a new paradigm. The very paradigm that Jessup is trying to describe with his language, and that I try to describe with the notion of neoliberal informationalism and with the figure of the flexible personality. So that's what we'll talk about tomorrow, and now you can ask questions. Sorry. Please.